England has mysterious demons, or mysterious ghosts of unknown origin, which the French call Neptunes and the English call Portunes. It belongs in their nature to take pleasure in the simplicity of happy peasants. When peasants stay up late at night for the pleasure of their domestic tasks, suddenly, though the doors are closed, they are there warming themselves at the first and eating little frogs which they bring out their pockets and roast on the coals. They have an aged appearance and a wrinkled face. They are very small in stature, measuring less than half a thumb, and they wear tiny rags sewn together. If there should be anything to be carried in the house or any heavy task to be done, they apply themselves quickly to the work and accomplish it more quickly than it could be done by any human means. It is a law of their nature that they can be useful but do no harm. Hello, welcome to the History and Folklore Podcast, where we look at different folk beliefs through history and how these beliefs shape people's perceptions of nature. Today we're looking at household spirits, their origins and the varying beliefs and practices surrounding them. Just for a bit of a content warning, this episode does have brief mention of human sacrifice, death of children and suicide. It is not explicitly described, but do listen at your own discretion. In order to understand what house spirits are and what they meant to people in the past, it is important to understand homes and what they represent. In stories, the home is a place of safety. The hero or heroine usually starts at home, and it is only when they leave the safety of their house that they meet adventure and danger. The house provides a protective barrier from the dangerous elements, animals and spirits that lie in the wilderness outside. On top of this, people were generally more tied to their house than they are today. Houses often passed from generation to generation, providing a constant through the ages while individual family members arrived and departed. Possibly because of this, a number of superstitions sprang up around Europe concerning houses, many of which focused on either building or moving to a new home. Across Europe, it was believed that various nature spirits lived in the landscape, inhabiting trees, rocks, or just living in the wild spaces, virtually undetected by humans. These spirits were often ambivalent or hostile to humans, and so were not likely to take kindly to people building a permanent residence in their territory. In Russia, it was believed that you could test whether a space was inhabited by malicious nature spirits by testing it over a series of nights. You might identify a place by finding a log or spot with lots of insects, which suggests that if there are spirits in the place, they do not mind other living creatures being present. You would then leave a chicken overnight. If the chicken was unharmed by the spirits, you may leave a sheep the next night, then a cow, then a horse, and lastly, you yourself would camp in the area you wish to build. If you survived the night unscathed, then you could be relatively certain that the area was safe to build on. There was also an additional problem, which is that the building would be made from wood of trees which would have spirits residing in them that could be brought into the house in the timber, making them hostile towards the inhabitants for the destruction of their trees. If this was the case, it would quickly become obvious, as the household would be beset by bad fortune, illness, accidents and the death of livestock. One story from Germany tells of a farm in which no calf lived. One day, when the family were discussing their misfortune, a tiny woman appeared and told them that the reason they could not raise cattle was because they had built the barn over her bed, and she had got woken by the cow's manure every morning. They moved the cattle shed, and their misfortunes stopped. A common belief across Europe was that a sacrifice could be performed to placate the spirits that live in the land or the materials intended for building. The type of sacrifice varied according to location, place and type of construction. Sometimes the sacrifice would be an object, such as coins placed into the foundations. Other times the sacrifice required an animal. Frogs, snakes and cats have all been attested to in local folklore, or found in the walls or foundations of old buildings across Europe. Later on, symbolic sacrifices were made, such as wine or eggs. However, there is also evidence of human sacrifice. This was particularly true for important communal buildings such as churches. In Latvia, it was apparently once a common phrase that every church requires a sacrifice, and there are many folk tales of churches crumbling overnight until someone, usually a young woman or a child, is walled up in a church pillar. There is evidence that this practice was also used for domestic constructions, although often in a far less violent manner. In southern Slavic countries, it was believed that the first person to walk past a construction should have their shadow bricked up. When I first read this, I thought that this would be a symbolical sacrifice, but apparently it was believed that the person whose shadow was trapped in the walls would die 40 days later. Interestingly, while the Byzantine Church banned this practice, they suggested burying a wild boar under the foundations instead, suggesting they didn't condemn the sacrificial practice as a whole. There are different interpretations of why a sacrifice might be required to build a house. The explanation already touched on was that it was a way of compensating the nature spirits in the area, or as a way of trying to appease or buy their benevolence, thereby transforming it into a household spirit. However, another potential interpretation is that it was a way of transferring the soul of the deceased animal or person into the building, thereby bestowing the house with its own spirit. Because houses were so tied to particular families, and because people generally moved around far less than they do today, family members would either be buried underneath the house, often under the doorway or hearth, or on a piece of land very close to the home after they died. There are many stories and practices related to the spirits of the ancestors visiting or residing in their old homes, and people would often leave food offerings out during certain festivals to honour and gain the blessings of their ancestors. Often young children who had died would be buried under the door frames and were believed to linger there. Any new babies born to a family with children who had previously died were not taken through the door until after their baptism, and instead were passed through the window. This is because it was believed that the soul of a person was less tied to the material world prior to baptism, and that the baby meeting the spirits of their brothers and sisters at the door may cause their spirit to join them. There are also stories of ancestors coming to visit the house. Sometimes they would visit the barrier spaces of doorways. In Bavaria, it was said that the souls of recently departed family members would come and visit by residing in the door hinges, which may explain any persistent creaking. However, the dead were more widely said to visit the hearth and warm themselves on the embers overnight. In Central Europe, babies would be presented to the ancestors by laying them on the bench next to the hearth for them to meet, and women would take care to put the hot iron cauldron stand away overnight, as it was said that if the soul of a dead person burned themselves on it, they would disappear forever and bring bad luck to the household. The hearth was also the domain of certain household gods. These could be gods that were part of the main pantheon of the area, for example the Greek goddess Hestia and the Norse goddess Frigg, both of whom were concerned with the hearth, home and the domestic sphere. However, many places also had the idea of smaller household deities that would be worshipped in the home at a specific shrine. These deities had much less power than the main more well-known gods, but exerted power over the confines of the house, and arguably had more effect on the day-to-day lives of the family they lived with and were worshipped by. These household deities would usually have a shrine dedicated to them in a specific area of the house. In Central and Eastern Europe, this would be a specific corner that was seen as sacred. In ancient Rome, daily rituals would be performed at the Lularium, the shrine to the household Lares, and food would be offered to the Penates, the household gods associated with the hearth, by throwing food into the flames at mealtimes or leaving a plate out next to the fire. Interestingly, the ancestors seem to also play a role in these spirits. In Plautus's play Aulularia, a dead ancestor leaves his fortune buried beneath the hearth. His son soon stops attending to his spirit with the traditional ceremonies and offerings and falls into poverty, while his daughter continues offerings and thrives. Although the worship of household deities was either banned or fizzled out in many countries with the arrival of Christianity, the cults of household gods and ancestors continued in rural areas. Eventually, the names and description of the spirit that protected the house changed from a lesser god or venerated ancestor to a supernatural entity that protected and looked after the family and should be respected and feared in similar ways, but not necessarily worshipped. You can see the links between house spirits and hearth cults through the continuation of placing food offerings out by the hearth as thanks for assistance with household chores. Specific spirits also have a strong association with the hearth. In Bulgaria, a new bride must sit close to the hearth and throw wood onto the fire to build relationship with the stopan and be accepted into the household. In Lithuania, the house spirit, the gabija, is seen almost as the embodiment of fire. It is believed that failing to properly tend to the hearth fire will cause the gabija to spread fire across the household. In Latvia, the chimney hook has particular significance. Visitors are expected to greet the chimney hook when they enter the kitchen, or else a resident of the house may get sick and die. One cautionary tale tells of a farmer who bought a new chimney hook and threw the old one in a field. He immediately became ill with a disease that could not be cured with any remedy. A servant walking through the field a few days later saw a small man near the hedge glaring at him with black eyes filled with hatred. The servant ran away but returned, only to see the old chimney hook lying in the grass. The chimney hook was returned, and the farmer immediately recovered. The link between house spirits and the dead is also common throughout Europe. The kikimora, known throughout Eastern Europe, were sometimes said to be the souls of unbaptized infants or those who committed suicide. In Scandinavia, the household niece or tomte was said to be the spirit of a person who built or first resided on the farmstead. It was often seen as good luck to have a household spirit. Although they would not often be seen, they would help with chores in the house, assist with caring for animals, and would warn the family of any impending accidents. However, because they are tied to the home, house spirits across Europe have very high standards for the houses cared for and maintained. The family should work to the spirit's way of doing things, as opposed to the other way round. If this did not happen, there could be dire consequences. The tomte in Scandinavia was immensely strong, and would strike a blow to any farmhand not pulling his weight. If the Bulgarian kikimora decided the house wasn't clean enough, she would bang pots and pans, tickle children in the night to make them scream, cause the milk from cows or goats to dry up, and scare chickens so that they can no longer lay eggs. It was seen as important to leave offerings to the household spirit to show gratitude for their work and effort. In Northern Europe, the most common offering was porridge with honey or butter, and again there were grave consequences for forgetting this. The spirit may curse the crops or products from the farm, in a similar vein to the kikimora, cause items to go missing, or simply abandon the farm altogether. There is a story of a hob in North Yorkshire who meted out punishment through bad luck, failing crops and eventual poverty after the husband failed to put out a bowl of porridge one evening. You can hear an excellent telling of this story on the Fairy Folk podcast. I would like to think that the spirit's insistence on these offerings and their violent retribution if they are ignored is them remembering back to when they were revered as actual deities and clinging to the trimmings of that life. So this would be similar to how deities in Terry Pratchett's Discworld or Neil Gaiman's American Gods increase or decrease in power depending on how much they're worshipped. Maybe the spirit's anger is due to their fear of falling even more into obscurity due to lack of gratitude. Conversely, getting too friendly with house spirits could cause them to leave. They disliked being seen by humans and would disappear if you acknowledged their presence when you spotted them. There are also numerous stories of people making smart clothes for them as a means of thanking them, only for them to disappear. Sometimes this disappearance is unexplained, such as in the well-known story The Elves and the Shoemaker, where a cobbler tries to repay the kindness of the elves by making them their own fine shoes. He sees that the gifts are gratefully received, only to find that they never again return. Other stories explicitly state that the house spirit is so pleased with their new finery that they stop doing chores to avoid damaging or dirtying them, and eventually disappear forever. Sometimes household spirits are less helpful. Like the tomte of Scandinavia or the English hob, the trasgu of Spain would sometimes do household chores if they were in a cheerful mood. However, they were often more mischievous and would hide things, make noise, and generally cause chaos. Described as small human-like creatures with a limp and a hole in one hand, you could get rid of them by giving them an impossible task, such as picking up grains which would fall through the hole in their hand. As Christianity grew in influence, so too did the demonisation of household spirits, although the belief in them as entities did linger. A later explanation given about their origin was that when Adam and Eve first had children they tried to hide them from God. Those that were hidden in the house and barn turned into the spirits of these places. Other times, the spirits were described as demons, such as in the description I read out at the start of this episode. This account was written in the 13th century by Gervase of Tilbury, and is thought to be the first medieval description of English house spirits. There are a number of accounts from this period and later that referred to household spirits as demons. The Tale of Thorfold, the far-travelled, who was one of the first Christian missionaries in Iceland, tells of how Thorfold went to his father's house with the Bishop Frederick. His family had a stone that they believed housed the household spirit, and would leave offerings to it. His father refused to be baptised, saying that he had always been served well by his household spirit, and did not want to abandon him for the new Christian God. To prove that God was stronger than the household spirit, Frederick sprinkled holy water over the stone, causing the spirit inside to be burned and the stone itself to explode. The notion of household spirits also existed in the romances of the Middle Ages. They were usually depicted as a servant who brought great prosperity to the house, could foresee and solve problems before they occurred, and could bring the master of the house anything he needed without being asked. One 13th century account tells of a servant to a knight who conjured a pass over a river, allowing the knight to escape his enemies, and found lioness's milk to cure his wife of illness. When asked how he had managed to do these things, the servant admitted that he was a demon that fell from heaven with Lucifer, but who had found comfort in being of help to mankind, and asked to continue in the knight's service. The fearful knight declined, but offered the demon a reward for his loyalty and assistance. The demon asked for a small amount of money, which he immediately returned to the knight, asking him to buy a bell for the abandoned church, so that Christians could be called to Mass. This does not sound like the behaviour of a demon, but the idea of an omniscient and helpful spirit does have a lot of similarities with house elves. The idea that they find comfort being around humans is also relevant, as Gervase of Tilbury describes spirits taking pleasure in being in the company of humans hard at work. There are also a number of accounts of homeless spirits inhabiting objects to be brought into the house unawares of the owner, suggesting that a homeless house spirit cannot enter a home under its own accord. They need to be brought in, invited or employed, and they actively want this to happen. French historian Claude Lecouteux suggests that house spirits are different to nature spirits precisely because they enjoy the comforts of domesticity, need a room with a warm fire to sit by, and enjoy the company of humans. This makes me wonder then what has happened to the house elves. They live for hundreds of years and enjoy being around humans and the comfort of home. Yet very few people now report having a house spirit. Some of the behaviours that have been mentioned, such as occupying an object that is brought into the home, and when they are unhappy about standards or lack of gratitude, lashing out by hitting, throwing, making noises and hiding objects, make me think of modern accounts of hauntings. Maybe we've accidentally attributed the same origin story to these entities as ancestral spirits, but have forgotten our proper relationship with them. I like the idea of the evolution of household spirit, from the spirit of the dead to household god to household spirit and back to the spirit of the dead. Maybe next time you encounter a ghost, put out a bowl of porridge for him and see what happens. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you didn't, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a review and follow me on Facebook at History and Folklore Podcast or Instagram at History and Folklore, where you can give feedback, be notified of future episodes, and also discover lots of strange and unusual history and folklore facts. You can also get in touch by emailing me at historyandfolklorepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, and I hope to see you for the next episode.